Science doesn't answer questions of ethics, for instance. Einstein once said, you can speak about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot speak about the scientific foundations of ethics. Nor does science deal with the question of meaning. And that's why some people who've put all their money on science are confused about the meaning of life, because science doesn't really go there. Indeed, recent research in psychiatry is absolutely fascinating. I listened in London just recently to Ian McGilchrist describing the results of a lifetime's work on the two halves of the brain. And his analysis goes like this, and it's being picked up by philosophers all around the world at the moment. You probably know the rudiments of it already. The left side of the brain is analytical. It's the scientific side. It's reductionistic. It analyzes, it measures, it counts. But there's a right-hand side to the brain. And the right-hand side of the brain integrates. It wants to see the big picture. It's interested in persons rather than things. And McGilchrist's thesis is this. He says, since the Enlightenment, we've focused on the left side of the brain. But because we've got a right side to our brain, we've got utterly confused, because the left side, with its scientific analyses, is not giving us either transcendence or meaning. Now, I find that fascinating, because that's something that's actually flowing out of science. And he's arguing, as he takes us on a fascinating journey through the history of Western philosophy, he's arguing that we need to get back to those bigger pictures, the meta-narratives, the world-views that give meaning, that integrate. And all of us in this room tonight and in the overflow, we all have a world-view. We've got our answers, not maybe completely formed. Our answers to the big questions of life. What is ultimate reality? What happens after death? What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? And so on. We've all got a worldview. And it's important as we enter into this question, God, fact or fiction, that we put it within a big picture so that we can see where we're all coming from. And it's simple, really, in a way. If you go back to the ancient Greeks, you'll find, as they looked at one of the fundamental worldview questions, and it's this: what is ultimate reality? And some people took the view that this universe is ultimate reality. Now they just changed universe to multiverse. It is ultimate reality. Mass energy is all essentially that exists. Now see what follows from that. If you believe that, you are a materialist or a naturalist, and therefore your notion of what it means to explain things is bottom up. Because mass energy is all that exists, so you have to explain everything. The universe, you, your consciousness, your life and you, bottom up. Now that worldview was popularized by Democritus and Leucippus and comes up to us through the centuries. But at the same time, there was another worldview espoused by Socrates, my intellectual hero, Plato and Aristotle and so on. And they said, no, mass energy isn't all that exists. There's something more. There's transcendence. There are the gods, or there is God. And so in the contemporary academy, we've got these two worldviews that collide together. They are, of course, diametrically opposed. Now, the interesting thing is this: when we ask the question, God, fact or fiction, what we're really asking is this: if you attack that question, what tools have you got to answer the questions? And one of our tools is, of course, science and philosophy and our experience. And what complicates the whole process these days is the fact that people like Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss more recently, and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, they tend to present to us a choice between science and God. Now, when you think about that for a moment, that raises in my mind two different things. Firstly, it shows they're confused about God. What do I mean by that? Well, when you analyze what many of these people mean by God, it's not what I mean by God or what most people mean by God. They mean a God of the gaps, that God is a fiction invented to fill gaps that science or other intellectual activity has not yet filled. So as knowledge increases, God disappears. If you believe in a God of the gaps, by definition, you have to choose between God and science, because the more God, the less science, the more science, the less God. The God of the gaps philosophy is summed up in these words: I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, that is not the view of any of the three great monotheistic religions, certainly not of the Christian faith. Because I believe that God is not a God of the gaps, he's the God of the whole show. He's the God of the bits we understand, and he's the God of the bits we don't understand. We can illustrate that historically. When Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, look, I've got a law, I don't need God. No, he didn't. He wrote the most brilliant book in the history of science, Principia Mathematica, arguing, hoping that an intelligent person would see that it would lead them to believe in an intelligent God. In other words, the more he understood of the universe out there, the more he admired the genius of the God that had done it that way. And a moment's thought shows you that life is like that. The more you understand about art, the more you can see the genius of a Rembrandt or a Picasso. The more you understand about engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls or a Royce or a Whittle. It's not the other way round. So this idea of pitching God against science comes from a totally inadequate view of God, but it comes from somewhere else. And it's this: choosing between God and science is like choosing between Frank Whittle and science as an explanation for the jet engine. You'd never dream of doing that. Because in order to explain a jet engine, you need several things. You need a scientific explanation in terms of law of turbojet generation, and also of mechanical engineering. That's the science explanation. But you also need an agent explanation in terms of the man who designed the jet engine. You need both. Now, it's as silly to say that because we've got scientific explanations of bits of the universe, that rules out God as a fiction. It's as silly to say, aha, I understand how a Ford motor car works, I think Henry Ford is a fiction. It's exactly the same argument. And yet so many people fall for it. This business of explanation is something that's worth doing a little bit of research into, ladies and gentlemen.